Sensational news. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. Crimea has lost an important radar. He says that's it. Tatarstan is without the Iranian drone storage. Russia is stopping gasoline exports. Up to 15% of oil refining has been destroyed. Strikes all across Russia. Infrastructure is paralyzed. The Russians, Muscovites, and people from St. Petersburg are just in a completely incoherent state.
It's just a total shit show over there.
It's just...
There were strikes. I just woke up from a sudden sharp bang. We all jump up. I say, what's going on? Dima says, Irina, they're bombing. We just open the balcony, look out, and right next to the house, the building is shaking. There's a refinery right next to the house. Oh my God, this is so scary.
Drones are transforming the Druzhba oil pumping station in Bryansk. Blazing hell. Oil refineries are burning in the Moscow region, Volgograd, Krasnodar Krai, Slavyansk, and Kuban. Powerful explosions in Crimea. More than 100 drones are attacking the occupied peninsula.
Guys, it's a drone attack. We were just sitting here. Hurry up.
Let's go. And basically, it flew right between us. Faster on the stairs. Shit, faster. Again, the second one.
This is a placeholder line for timing purposes. Please replace with your actual script content.
There, the signal is jammed. Mobile internet is down. A powerful Russian radar, Skala-M, has been destroyed. Everything is burning.
Ah, the siren. That's it. Let's go. We're leaving. We're leaving.
We fucking came to the sea.
Tatarstan is on fire. The Shaheds stored there have been destroyed. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan right now. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Marina Goko, well, we really are starting to strike very intensively now. So we have destroyed or severely damaged the helium plant in Orenburg. This is the only facility in Russia that produces a critical component for missiles. How much could this impact the Russian missile program and defense industry?
Well, it will definitely reduce production, although they do have a sufficient number of laboratories where helium can be produced, including on an industrial scale. So right now, if there is a certain critical shortage of helium, they can switch production. But that's another matter. This plant processed 15 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That's the main point. So if the attempt to shut down the gas processing plant succeeds, and I think if not the first time, then the second, it will make it possible to expect that the Russians will at least have to cap their wells, their gas wells, because they simply won't have anywhere to send the gas. What does 15 billion cubic meters mean? Ukraine consumes 15 billion cubic meters for its own needs. That's at the present moment. Before it was up to 20 when we were at full capacity. Right now, we consume about 15 billion cubic meters. So that's the consumption of an entire country by a single plant. If you strike it, then at the very least, first of all, they don't get a certain amount of oil, gas, and so-called dollars. The currency from oil exports is their economy. It's a blow to the economy. And secondly, they have nowhere to put the gas, so they'll have to shut down the wells. A shut-in well later on will take several years to restore, or they'll have to flare it. But if you flare for too long, let's say, it gets damaged as well. Because here it's a triple blow, I would say, all at once to the Russian economy, the military and technological aspects, especially regarding the transfer and involvement of certain services in the placement of this gas. That's the right approach. This is how intelligence works. I've always said when intelligence chooses its own targets, as long as no one interferes with them. They target such key points that, if destroyed, either halt the entire technological production cycle or deliver several blows in multiple directions at once, like this helium plant. And where is it located? All the way near Kazakhstan, not far from Aktobe, at least by local standards, so they managed to reach it.
An attack on the Druzhba oil pumping station. The largest oil pipeline hub near Bryansk is on fire. And can we say, as you always do, that this marks the beginning of a systemic collapse of Russia's oil infrastructure? We're making a concerted effort to strike.
Well, we can already talk about it because over the past 2 weeks, there have been specifically systematic, and that's very important, systematic strikes on Russian oil pumping and oil refining. As for the oil and gas sector, I specifically highlighted the strike on the helium plant, but in reality, it's a strike on gas processing, 15 billion cubic meters. Plus, if we list the most recent strikes, for example, on oil refineries, Novokuybishevsky, Ryazansky, Afipsky, Saratovsky, Uktinsky, and there were strikes. On Wednesday, there were strikes on the Novoshaktinsky and Volgograd oil refineries. The oil refinery. So this is definitely systematic now, plus the strike on Unecha. Remember how many years we've talked about Unecha? Well, now it's Unecha, which is 40 kilometers from the LPDS Unecha on the Druzhba oil pipeline. It's called the Druzhba oil pipeline, right? That's in the Bryansk region. And the oil that's pumped there is mainly from Tatarstan, Tatar oil in the Druzhba pipeline. Every day, 300,000 barrels of oil pass through Unecha. That's $18 million that the Russian economy receives daily from selling this oil. After Uneka, the oil continues on its way. There near Mamai. Mamai is another pumping station. Then the oil pipeline branches off, with one pipe going to Usluga near St. Petersburg. That's where the Russian so-called shadow fleet, the tanker fleet, is loaded. Part of the pipeline goes to Belarus, branching off again to the Naftan refinery, the Belarusian oil refinery, and to the Mosier refinery. From Mosier, the pipeline branches off again, heading to Poland and Germany. All of this oil, everything that passes through Unecha, is what was hit today, and part of the pipeline, together with the already refined oil in the form of diesel. There are two pipelines, a diesel product pipeline and the Druzhba oil pipeline, both going through Ukraine, which we pump to Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. But the Czech Republic has already refused oil. Russian oil was brought in, and Italian oil was sent through the pipeline. So there is a kind of rejection of Russian oil going on. Nevertheless, a strike on Uneka practically stops this entire cluster if we finish off Uneka. This time, for the first time, we struck it. Unsuccessfully, as I understand it, because there was no confirmation of a fire. But still, the technological cycle, after the chemical analysis of the oil was checked, it was stopped. Today's strike, or yesterday's, you could say, this strike has already inflicted some damage. Well, it's not far, 40 kilometers. So basically, if we've started, believe me, it will burn. Unecha will burn, but in order to completely stop the oil flow, you need to destroy 3 consecutive oil pumping stations. That is, we need to work on Mamai, basically starting with the steel horse, if you remember. We talked about it 6 months ago, the steel horse that's over there in Zabryansk. Steel horse, Desna, Unecha, and in the Mamai area, all of that needs to be taken out, and then it will be possible to completely stop the oil flow through the Druzhba pipeline. I think that's exactly what will happen. So we have the opportunity, as long as our hands aren't tied by various mechanisms like they were at the beginning of the year when we started, by the way, with that same Unecha. There were good strikes on Unecha, the steel horse, and Desna, and Unecha again somewhere around February, March, but then in March we were stopped. Roman Igorovich,
regarding the analysis, the strikes on the oil refineries in Volgograd, in Krasnodar Krai, in Slavyansk, in Kuban, and the simultaneous attacks across all these regions. Roman Igorovich, what does this indicate, and to what extent are we actually able to carry out such attacks? The fuel market and military supplies in Russia, how will these strikes specifically affect the fuel market and military supplies in Russia?
Well, I've already mentioned them. All 7 of these Russian oil refineries are million-ton plants. There are about 30 of these million-ton plants in Russia, maybe just over 30 in total. Not many. There are another 50 small ones, but those are really just small fry, more like moonshine stills, to be honest. And the real million-ton plants, there are about 30 to 35 of them. So you could say we've already reached 7 of them. That's a quarter, well, a quarter or a fifth, depending on the number in operation and their production volume. We can completely shut down all Russian oil refining. And if oil refining stops, oil production will stop as well. Halting oil production will lead to the shutdown of oil wells. There are thousands of them, but still with nowhere to send the oil, they'll have to shut them down. Reopening a shut-in well is sometimes a real gamble, so that everything settles down there, because there are certain factors related to water injection, but those are technological cycles. That's why strikes on oil refineries are very important for us. In other words, shutting down the refineries first will hit the Russian economy and lead to the beginning of Russia's collapse. That's the only way to defeat Russia. And naturally, the fuel that was supposed to go to the Russian army simply won't get there. It won't be produced. The strikes on plants that produce are especially important. Aviation kerosene. By the way, the first 2 plants, Novokubishevsky and Ryazansky, they produce aviation kerosene, or rather they used to produce aviation kerosene. And the strikes were justified, meaning the targets were chosen correctly. The main thing now is not to stop, so that in the near future, all those people who are trying to tie the hands of our armed forces in dismantling the Russian Empire don't force us to stop striking the oil refineries by pushing us into some kind of air ceasefire or something like that. if this kind of work continues for half a year, just look, in 2 weeks, 7 oil refineries. By the end of the year, the Russians won't have a single one left, and we'll get to the Omsk one too. If we manage to reach the Orenburg refinery near Kazakhstan, then believe me, we have plenty of acquaintances in Kazakhstan who will at least help us get to Omsk as well. Omsk is the biggest one. They process 21 million tons a year.
Roman Igorovich, the Russian government has banned the export of petroleum products because of Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries.
That's right. Again, it's a double blow. First of all, what did the ban on gasoline exports lead to? To a decrease in foreign currency earnings for the Russian economy. A blow? Of course it's a blow. It seems that as soon as 2 plants were hit back then, Novokuybishevsky and Ryazansky, they immediately made the decision because Novokuybishevsky processes 7 million tons per year and Ryazansky processes about 15 to 17 million tons. Basically, that's like one Omsk plant, like one large Russian refinery. Naturally, this shortage was felt immediately. And even more so, why does the shortage have such an impact? Because a Russian mobilization began. An army on the move consumes a huge amount of fuel. Naturally, there isn't enough. Either the army won't have enough or it's still harvest season. So for the harvest or for private use by the civilian population, the population. Naturally, they had to make the decision to restrict gasoline exports right away. Gasoline started to rise in price, at least on the markets, on the major markets, on the wholesale markets. And that's already an indicator that there is a real gasoline shortage. And it's definitely going to continue in the future. Moreover, it's precisely the gasoline shortage that could lead to serious stagnation in the Russian economy through inflation, because 50, sometimes 70% in Russian goods prices are basically the cost of delivery, that is the price of gasoline itself. Naturally, if gasoline starts getting more expensive, then consumer goods will also start to rise in price for Russians. And Russians live by their TV and their refrigerator. And then this herd, if they open the fridge and see nothing there, just a fig with poppy seeds, well, they'll lick the poppy seeds, sure, look at the fig and then start mooing. And not just mooing, they'll start looking for horns somewhere, ready to butt heads, and that's a big problem for Putin. By the way, that's what he fears most, when the Russian mooing, bleating herd starts looking for something to eat, because their salaries just aren't enough to fill the fridge. But you can't really feed people with television. You can only feed their brains, but the stomach has nothing to do with television.
Roman Grigorievich, last night more than 100 drones attacked occupied Crimea. There is information that the radar Skala-M was destroyed in Crimea. This means the loss of the ability to control up to 350 kilometers of airspace. And what does this now mean for the defense of occupied Crimea and the use of Russian aviation, Roman Grigorievich?
There isn't just one radar there. These are the radars of the enemy's radio technical troops. About 3 to 5 of them are destroyed per week, that's for sure. So on one hand, there is a systematic clearing of Crimea, and on the other hand, an interesting action is being carried out. After we destroy the radars, the Russians take radars from their anti-aircraft missile systems, for example, from some oil refinery, and transfer them to Crimea. Crimea is their priority. Naturally, this means you don't have to run all over Russia destroying every air defense system. You can just focus on Crimea and they'll bring them there themselves, just like in Chornobyivka. So it's like a big Chornobyivka. How many times was it? 30 times they hit the Russians, the Russian troops with new strikes in Chornobyivka. So these are the strikes. It's the same picture here in Crimea. You can focus on destroying all of the enemy's air defenses through Crimea. They'll bring them there themselves. They'll leave their rear areas exposed, but they'll try to protect Crimea, the Kerch Bridge. So today's strike on Crimea, which we're talking about now, is exactly one of those attacks. Moreover, it was a large-scale attack, not just the radar was hit. The strikes were mainly carried out on Feodosia, on the Kerch Bridge, and in the area around the Kerch Bridge, as well as on the Port Kavkaz, which is near the Kerch Bridge, and is used first of all for pumping fuel into Crimea. There are pumps installed there. Naturally, there are also railroad ferries that go to Crimea. They are loaded on the Caucasus side where there are railway tracks. Then they are unloaded in the area around Kerch. So this was a massive strike on Crimea. I think within a day, the General Staff will confirm it after decoding the means of objective control, or at least the satellites will show where the strikes were delivered. But the strike was serious. In other words, the strike targeted Feodosia, some military facilities, and the port of Kavkaz.
Roman Nikolaevich, today I watched a report related to occupied Crimea, and it said that The Gauleiters, the occupiers, the occupation authorities made a statement that now there will be no mobile connection or internet at all in the territory of occupied Crimea for a very long time. This was done so that they could fight against the drones of the Ukrainian armed forces. So right now they've shut down communications and mobile internet on the occupied peninsula. What does this indicate?
They're afraid at this very moment. Why are they doing this from a military logic standpoint? It's a prelude. Why? Because there is a certain protocol for protecting high-risk facilities, as they call it, like the Kerch Bridge. In order to fully secure, let's say, from reconnaissance to counter-reconnaissance and targeting, all communications are shut down. Naturally, the highest security protocol for the Kerch Bridge has now been activated, and they're going to shut everything down. Everyone will be marching around the parade ground for these few days until Friday, and probably even after Friday, most likely until Monday. Because starting Friday, they won't be able to go on a drinking binge like Russians usually do. That's why I think they'll keep this maximum security mode, at least in terms of safety, and keep the Crimean bridge closed until Monday. We'll see. But here's the thing. We don't always use Russian communications either. There are other mechanisms.
The second RCBU was also destroyed by a Shahed drone in Tatarstan. We did it again just a few days later. A repeated strike on a target 1,300 kilometers from Ukraine. At this point, how does this demonstrate the capabilities of long-range drones and their strategic effect?
By the way, judging by the video, these are already new drones. These are already drones like the Iranian ones, Russian or Iranian Shaheds, or Chinese ones, and the Chinese Sunflower 200, meaning it's a wing-type drone, so we've already set up serial production, and at least at our own base, the same SBU guys have set up the production of pretty decent drones, all things considered. The thing is, it's precisely the wing configuration that makes it possible, if you have enough fuel and a good engine, to send these drones several thousand kilometers. It all depends on the reliability of the engine and the amount of fuel. So we went into this area and we took the right approach, because fixed wing drones are, of course, better used at short ranges. At least that's how we use the Bobber drones, for example, or similar ones. The same Fierce and 196S, for example, fixed wing types like that are very easy to shoot down since their speed is still relatively low. But a winged drone can be accelerated to good speeds, and eventually you could even install not just an internal combustion engine, but a turbine without significantly changing the configuration of the aircraft itself. So, in other words, they started thinking ahead, and basically, if the SBU got involved in this, believe me, they're doing a great job in this regard. First of all, when it comes to target designation and carrying out combat missions, they've made significant progress. And also in the production of this type of drone. Well, as for the Geran drones being Russian-Chinese now, and because they're Russian-Chinese, they can produce a huge number of them. So what is a Geran? Right now, a Geran is a body cast in Russia. The body is Russian. The engine is already supplied by the Chinese. They've set up a factory in Russia. The internal combustion engine, though, is still being produced in Russia for now. The turbines are still being made by the Chinese. That's for the Geran 3. Most of the components and assemblies, especially the servos and some control systems, are Chinese. Over 50% of it is Chinese made. And the main board is produced at EMEA Progress Control. So that's what a Geran is. And now they've started producing a huge number of them. They produce 150 to 200 per day. They use up to 100 against us, which means they're storing about 100 for themselves. The security service identified these warehouses and sent drones there. As for the extent of the damage, we'll get confirmation in some time, I think, but the work needs to continue. Even at a distance of 1,500 kilometers, these drones can reach their targets. The main thing is to scale up production and keep hitting them constantly. Believe me, this issue can be solved, the numbers can be reduced, or rather in Iran and at the warehouses, and eventually to get to the production sites themselves. Because the production facilities need to be taken out, and not just in Russia, because without destroying the production in China, we won't reach a certain level. In the end, even if all production in Russia is destroyed, they'll just move it to China and start bringing in Chinese drones.
Roman Igorovich, here is some fresh information that confirms your words. Bloomberg reports that the Saratov oil refinery has stopped receiving oil after the latest drone attack. This could affect gasoline supplies. The situation is dire. It belongs to Rosneft. Roman Igorovich, please comment on this.
This Saratov plant on the banks of the Volga used to process 7 million tons of oil. So it's between, the Volga divides it. So you have Saratov and Yelts. On the west side is Saratov, and on the left bank to the east is Yelts. And this plant was right on the bank of the Volga. Naturally, it was only a matter of time before we reached it. The main thing is they gave the order when they allowed us to strike, as they say. The question of why it was forbidden before is another matter. That's Article 111 of the Criminal Code. And after they started striking, of course, the Saratov oil refinery immediately came under attack. And it's not going anywhere. It's been standing there for 90 years. This plant is 90 years old. If I remember correctly, this plant is called the cracking plant. It was only a matter of time before it would be hit. They hit it, the mission was accomplished. That the drone forces, I believe, carried it out with the Bezbek. And ours, they also have the AN-196, which are exactly those fierce Antonov drones that delivered the strike. It came to a complete halt. So you could say that at least 7 million tons, Russians will now have to figure out what to do with it. And most likely, since they can no longer send extra oil to foreign markets, they will start to suppress, to stifle the production structure. And the shortage of gasoline. This plant mainly produced gasoline and diesel. And naturally, this gasoline and diesel is now reaching neither the domestic market nor the foreign market because it's shut down, nor the Russian army. Besides, it didn't really supply Moscow that much anyway. In order to cut off, say, fuel supplies to Moscow and the Moscow region, you would need to take out 2 more plants. Take out the supply chain. Who supplies there? Mainly, that's the Kapotnya oil refinery. It supplies almost half of the gasoline and diesel for Moscow and the Moscow region. And if we really finish the job, if we hit the Druzhba oil pipeline and shut it down along its entire length, then the Mozyr refinery, Belarus used to send the other half of the fuel to Moscow, the Mozyr refinery. So not only will Muscovites be unable to fly out, now they won't even be able to leave by other means. Just imagine spending the velvet season sitting somewhere in Moscow's basements.
Tatiana Marinova, a very important topic is the enemy's offensive, the enemy's advance near Dobropolye, and the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Let's start with Dobropolye, a breakthrough of 15 to 18 kilometers, the capture of Kucheryov Yar and Zolotoy Kolodets. Is this at the moment a local tactical operation or the beginning of a major enemy offensive?
The thing is, when carrying out the tasks of the first wave, these are shaping operations, so-called reconnaissance by combat, attempts to break through the front lines. Then the second wave moves in there. The second wave, which is now starting to arrive, we can already see it, equipment, ammunition, personnel, all fresh, so to speak. They can enter the breakthrough if it happens and then move out into the operational space where, as they say, it's wide open. You can go wherever you want as far as you can get until you run out of fuel. So this breakthrough doesn't exist right now because everyone keeps saying breakthrough, breakthrough. No, there is no operational breakthrough. What we have is operational seepage through our positions. But why has this operational seepage occurred? Because we don't have enough troop density along the line of contact, especially on the main section from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. Well, it's not enough. Everyone understands that perfectly well. There should be 3 strong points per kilometer. In other words, a company should be covering 1 kilometer. Sometimes in our case, a company is covering several kilometers. And sometimes there's just 1 strong point for several kilometers. Naturally, between these platoon strong points, the Russians can slip through in sufficient numbers to then gather somewhere in the rear and cause trouble at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers. So in this way, they've broken through, but not in the sense of a full breakthrough. No one saw them. They slipped through. They slipped through and then started sneaking around in the rear, as it's called. Deep State drew a map showing the breakthrough as such. There was no breakthrough, and at the moment, a decision has been made to transfer reserves there to plug the gaps in that direction. We've been talking about this for 3 months. A decision needs to be made. Syrsky needed to make a decision not to run around the Sumy, Kursk, Kharkiv, and Belgorod regions, but to focus on the Eastern Front. Why? Because the main objective for the Russians is to capture the Donetsk region. Naturally, they will put pressure on Mirnograd and Pokrovsk because without Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, they can't advance to Dobropilya, and without Dobropilya, they ultimately won't be able to approach Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Drushkivka from the west. This operation is obvious. It's right there on the map. And our third line of defense was holding the Russians back quite well until Syrsky started reducing the density of our troops. Why he started to reduce it, let them figure that out themselves. Whether politicians told him to, or he came up with it himself, decided to play games with Dropet, or just simply decided to give up Donbass. I don't know why. But judging by the inaction, I'll say it again. If we hadn't been talking about this for 3 months, maybe it wouldn't be worth mentioning now. But for 3 months, in almost every broadcast, we said that in order to hold the Eastern Front, we needed to increase troop density by deploying a line of security forces. Well, every stream talks about this. So what happened? In the end, they did deploy a line of security forces, sent the National Guard there, the First Corps, the National Guard. Those are the security forces. The National Guard is part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which needs to be included. There are 1,300 of them, and we need 100 for the armed forces of Ukraine. And that's it. There will be no more questions. There won't be these breakthroughs. Well, it's not a breakthrough. I'll say it again. It's infiltration. Infiltration that our observation posts simply didn't notice. And then when they showed up in the rear, that's when they started dealing with these issues. It's pretty much the same situation, as, remember when Lapti and Aladdin once said they didn't notice the Ukrainian troops who got into their rear last year in Kursk. That was the same kind of tactical infiltration. In other words, there were too few Lapti and Ladin along the borderline. Our troops slipped through between them, and then they were simply crushed from the rear. They were pressed down and a breakthrough occurred. So to prevent such a breakthrough, it's better not to allow it in the first place. That is, immediately increase the troop density along the Donetsk front. The Russians won't launch any large-scale offensives anywhere else, nowhere except the Donetsk and part of the Zaporizhia front. Why Pavel Sharim? Is it necessary to expand the land corridor? Why is Putin now demanding that we withdraw ourselves from the Donetsk direction?
Roman Nikolaevich, and you just spoke very concisely, but I would like you to specifically articulate separately for our audience, because this is very important for them, about the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. So what is the danger for the armed forces of Ukraine in this sector?
If Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are encircled, they will push us out of this direction. After that, they will have what is called operational space almost all the way to Pavlograd. That's already the Dnipropetrovsk region. And in reality, the operational space extends all the way to Dnipro. That's why, for example, when the Poles talk about reaching the Dnipro, they mean the Dnipro River, because they could advance not only toward Pavlograd or Dnipro, but also toward Kremenchuk or Poltava, that is from the left bank. Basically, wherever they want, is practically all flatland there. That is the third ridge, the so-called Donetsk ridge is the third and last line of defense, which our forces are currently holding in the area of Pokrovsk, from Pokrovsk to Kostiantinivka. If you let them through, then only the Dnipro will be able to stop them further on. I mean, the Dnipro River. Do you know why the Poles are now building a defense system, and where? On the Vistula. Not along the border with, say, Belarus or even the Kaliningrad region, because it's flat terrain. And the first real obstacle is the Vistula. That's why on the western bank of the Vistula, they're building a certain system there. By the way, they're doing the right thing. This is the correct course of action. So we can't allow the Russians to break through the third line of defense. Otherwise, we'll have to catch them on the right bank of the Dnipro later. They're already milling around on the left bank near Kherson. So that's why this is a very dangerous situation at the moment. And why have we been talking about it for 3 months? We're not talking about it for nothing. Stop running around in Sumy and Kursk. The Russians aren't going to advance on Sumy and Kiev from the Kursk direction. Don't believe those crazy deputies who have worn their hands down to the elbows digging Kiev's defense system. There's no need to dig in around Kiev. They won't make it to Kiev. Pull those deputies back. Let those chatterboxes on the radio pass some laws instead. Otherwise, in their foolishness, they'll dig all the way to the center of the earth. They started digging around Kiev, and now even the so-called military comrades, well, not exactly military, you know what I mean. So there's no need to run anywhere. It's all just so-called flashbangs, diversionary maneuvers. It's the same story in Kharkiv, by the way, and in Kherson too. But the real pressure from the Russians will be focused on breaking through the third line of defense to capture Donetsk. The Donetsk front lines. And that's where they're concentrating. This is something Syrskyi needs to explain, though I don't know. How many times does he need to explain it? Do you think he doesn't understand? He's just as much a military man as I am. He understands this perfectly well. Any lieutenant understands this. Just by looking at the elevation map, seeing the disposition of forces and assets on both sides, you immediately grasp where one side will advance and what the other side needs to do. When if Syrskyi understands this but isn't acting, then it means he's deliberately not doing it, either because of his own considerations or due to political orders he receives from the office. So let them figure it out themselves, but we won't let you surrender Donbass, dear Green deputies.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few words in the comments to support Ukraine and its armed forces. Roman Hryhorovych and I are working for you, for audiences all over the world, so that they know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. Renowned military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Horovic, thank you. And as usual, see you this Friday.
Goodbye.